The scorching summer heat hung over Dustwater Creek like a woolen blanket, but Clarice Cooper didn't notice the sweat trickling down her spine or the way her vision blurred at the edges. All she could focus on was remaining upright in the long line outside the general store, clutching her basket with trembling fingers as the world tilted dangerously around her. 3 days without proper food and only sips of water had left her weaker than she'd ever been. But pride kept her silent, even as her knees threatened to buckle beneath her faded calico skirt. "Madam," came a deep voice beside her. "Take my strength." Clarice turned her head slowly, afraid any sudden movement might send her sprawling into the dirt. The man who had spoken stood tall beside her, his broad shoulders blocking the merciless sun. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see kind eyes watching her with concern. "I don't need charity," she whispered, though her body betrayed her as she swayed slightly. "It ain't charity to help a neighbor," he replied, gently taking her elbow to steady her. "Yates Vaughn, madam, new to these parts." He guided her to a wooden bench outside the store. "You sit here while I hold your place in line." Clarice wanted to protest, but the relief of sitting was too great. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. I'm Clarice Cooper." The year was 1878, and Dustwater Creek was just another struggling settlement in the New Mexico territory, where hope was as scarce as rainfall and twice as precious. Clarice had arrived 6 months earlier after her husband died on the journey west, leaving her alone with broken dreams and dwindling resources. Yates returned 20 minutes later with her supplies and a canteen of water. "Drink," he insisted, pressing it into her hands. "Slowly now. You didn't have to do this," she said, but accepted the water gratefully. "Maybe not," he agreed, a smile warming his sun-weathered face. "But I believe we're put on this earth to help each other through the rough patches." He knelt before her, his eyes a startling blue against his tanned skin studying her face. "When's the last time you ate something proper, Mrs. Cooper?" Clarice looked away, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "It's been a while." Yates nodded, not pressing further. "Well then, I'd be honored if you'd join me for a meal at the hotel restaurant. Nothing fancy, just some decent food to put some strength back in you." "I can't accept. You can pay me back someday," he cut in gently. "That's how things work out here. We help each other survive." Something in his voice, a loneliness that echoed her own, made her nod in agreement. Just this once. The hotel restaurant was cool and dim after the blinding sunlight. Clarice felt self-conscious in her worn dress, but Yates treated her with a respect she hadn't experienced since arriving in Dustwater Creek. When their food arrived, hearty stew with fresh bread, she tried to eat slowly, though hunger made her fingers tremble. "You homesteading?" Yates asked between bites. "Trying to," Clarice replied. "My husband Thomas and I set out from Missouri last year. He had dreams of building something of our own. Took fever on the trail, and—" She paused, composing herself. "I decided to continue on. Seemed the right thing to do." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Brave decision. Foolish, some might say. Those some ain't ever had dreams worth chasing then." He poured her more water. "Where's your claim?" "North of town, about 5 miles. It's good land, with a creek running through it." Pride crept into her voice despite her exhaustion. "I've managed to clear some for planting, but it's slow going." Yates leaned back, studying her. "Mrs. Cooper, I hope you don't find this forward, but I've been looking for honest work. I've got experience with farming, ranching, building pretty much anything that needs doing. I could help with your land, just until you get properly established." Suspicion flared in Clarice's eyes. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "I know what it's like to have a dream and no help to make it real," he said simply. "I'm not asking for anything improper. I can build myself a lean-to away from your cabin. You need the help, and I need the work." Clarice considered his offer. Working alone was killing her slowly, she knew that. But trusting a stranger seemed dangerous, especially out in the isolation of her homestead. "You can ask about me in town," Yates added, as if reading her thoughts. "I've been here 3 weeks, doing odd jobs for Mr. Prescott at the livery and helping Sheriff Dawson repair the jail after that last storm." She nodded slowly. "I'll think on it, Mr. Vaughn. That's all I ask." He smiled, and something in Clarice's chest loosened just a fraction. True to her word, Clarice asked around town about Yates Vaughn. What she learned was sparse but reassuring. He'd arrived from Colorado, where he'd worked as a ranch hand for several years. He was quiet but reliable, paid his debts, and didn't cause trouble. Sheriff Dawson described him as solid, which was high praise from a man known for his taciturn nature. 3 days later, when Yates appeared at her homestead leading a pack horse loaded with supplies and tools, Clarice met him at the edge of her property with cautious acceptance. 3 conditions, she said firmly. You build your shelter at least 50 yards from my cabin. You understand this is temporary, just until harvest. And you accept fair wages for fair work, nothing more. Yates removed his hat respectfully. Yes, madam. All reasonable terms. The land Clarice had claimed was beautiful, but demanding 20 acres of potential farmland with a clear stream cutting through it and rolling hills in the distance. Her small cabin stood as a testament to her determination, but the fields around it needed far more attention than one person could provide. By sunset, Yates had constructed a simple lean-to against a stand of cottonwoods and outlined his plans for the coming days. First thing, he explained over a simple supper outside the cabin. We need to finish clearing that north section for planting. Then repair your roof, it's got a bad leak on the east side. Clarice nodded, watching him thoughtfully. In the fading light, with his guard down, she could see weariness etched into the lines around his eyes. Like her, he carried burdens he didn't speak of. How'd you learn all these skills? She asked. A shadow crossed his face. Necessity, mostly. My pa died when I was 14. Had to keep our farm going for Ma and my sisters. He took a sip of coffee. Then the war came. After that, well, a man picks up what he needs to survive. The war changed everything. Clarice agreed softly. My father never really came home from it, even though he walked through our front door. They fell silent, the shared understanding creating a fragile connection between them. The next morning established a pattern that would continue for weeks. They rose before dawn, worked until the heat became unbearable, rested during the worst of the afternoon sun, then continued until dusk. Clarice matched Yates hour for hour, refusing to be outworked on her own land, though he never commented on it. By the end of the first week, the north field was cleared, and Yates had repaired the cabin roof. By the end of the second, they had planted corn and beans, and Yates had constructed a small chicken coop using scavenged lumber. You should get some hens next time you're in town, he suggested. Fresh eggs would do you good. Clarice nodded, trying not to think about how his presence had already changed her homestead, making it feel more like the home she dreamed of when she and Thomas had set out from Missouri. The early summer days blended into each other, marked by small victories and growing companionship. Yates respected her boundaries, but filled the lonely silence that had been Clarice's only companion for months. They shared meals and stories, carefully avoiding the deeper hurts that had shaped them. One evening, as they sat watching fireflies dance over the newly planted fields, Yates finally asked the question that had been in his eyes for weeks. Why do you really stay, Clarice? After your husband passed, most women would have turned back. She considered her answer carefully. Partly because going forward seemed easier than going back to nothing. Partly because Thomas believed in this dream so fiercely. She paused, looking out at the land that was slowly becoming hers in truth, not just on paper. But mostly because I needed to know if I could do it on my own. If I was strong enough. And are you? Strong enough. Some days, she admitted. Others. Well, you saw me in town that day. Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. Strength isn't about never faltering. It's about continuing even when you do. The next day brought unexpected trouble. Clarice was working in the vegetable garden she'd started near the cabin when 3 riders approached. She recognized them immediately, the Harlow brothers, who owned the largest ranch in the area and had made it clear they thought the land she occupied should be theirs. Mrs. Cooper, called the eldest, Wade Harlow, not bothering to dismount. Thought I'd check if you'd reconsidered my offer. Clarice straightened, wiping soil from her hands. My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Harlow. This land is mine, legally claimed and registered. Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. A woman alone has no business trying to farm out here. It's dangerous country. She ain't alone, came Yates's voice as he emerged from behind the cabin, axe in hand. He approached casually, but positioned himself slightly in front of Clarice. Wade's expression hardened. Didn't realize you'd taken on help. Mrs. Cooper. Mr. Vaughn is my business partner, Clarice said firmly, noting how Yates's eyebrows lifted slightly at her choice of words. Well, ain't that interesting, drawled the youngest Harlow, a man known for his quick temper. Seems mighty convenient. Yates stepped forward, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. Gentlemen, was there something specific you needed today? The middle brother spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Just making neighborly conversation. Then we appreciate the visit, Yates replied evenly. But we've got work to finish before sundown. A tense silence followed before Wade finally nodded. We'll be seeing you around, Mrs. Cooper. His gaze shifted to Yates. You too, Vaughn. As they rode away, Clarice released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They've been pressing me to sell since I arrived. Wade Harlow thinks everything north of the creek should be part of his range. Men like that don't stop easily, Yates observed, watching the riders disappear over the rise. Best keep your rifle loaded. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, bringing welcome rain but also fierce winds that howled around the cabin's sturdy walls. Unable to sleep, Clarice sat by the window, watching lightning illuminate the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes. A knock at her door startled her. She grabbed her shotgun before answering, though she knew it would be Yates. Sorry to disturb you, he said, rain dripping from his hat. But the creek's rising fast. We might need to move the new seedlings on the lower field. Together, they worked through the downpour, building a temporary levee to divert water from the most vulnerable crops. The mud was slick and treacherous, and more than once they had to catch each other to prevent falls. By the time they finished, both were soaked to the skin and exhausted. Come inside, Clarice said impulsively as they approached the cabin. You shouldn't have to sleep in that lean-to tonight. Yates hesitated. I don't want to compromise your reputation. Clarice almost laughed. My reputation? Out here. She shook her head. You can sleep by the fire. It's the least I can do after you saved our crops. Inside, she gave him a blanket and her husband's old clothes to change into while she did the same behind a screen in the corner. The cabin was small, just one room with a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a bed, and some shelves, but it felt like a palace compared to the elements outside. When she emerged in dry clothes, Yates was stoking the fire, his wet garments hanging from a chair nearby. Thomas's shirt was tied across his shoulders, and the sight of him in her husband's clothes stirred complicated feelings she wasn't ready to examine. Thank you, she said, to fill the sudden awkwardness. For tonight. For everything. Yates looked up, firelight casting shadows across his face. You don't need to thank me. We're partners, right? The word hung between them, weighted with possibilities neither was prepared to acknowledge. Right, she agreed softly. Partners. Morning brought clear skies and the realization that the storm had been a blessing in disguise. The creek, though higher, had deposited rich silt across parts of their fields, and the rain had saved them days of carrying water from the stream. It also brought a subtle shift in their relationship. The boundaries Clarice had so carefully maintained began to blur as summer deepened around them. They still worked separately for much of each day, but meals were shared, and evenings often found them sitting together on the cabin's small porch, talking or simply enjoying the companionable silence. Yates proved to be a man of surprising depths. He could quote Shakespeare and calculate complex sums in his head. He played the harmonica with haunting skill and knew endless stories that made Clarice laugh despite herself. But he never spoke of his life between the war and his arrival in Dustwater Creek, and Clarice never asked. July brought scorching heat and their first trip to town together. The journey was necessary, they needed supplies, and Clarice had promised eggs and vegetables to several townspeople, but it also meant facing public scrutiny of their arrangement. As they loaded their wagon with the last of their goods from the general store, Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of Dustwater Creek, approached. Mrs. Cooper, she said, her voice carrying just enough to ensure others would hear. I'm so glad to see you in better health than your last visit. Her gaze slid meaningfully to Yates. Though I must say, there's been talk about your situation. Clarice straightened her spine. My situation, Mrs. Pemberton? A young widow, living unchaperoned with a man not her husband. Well, it raises questions about propriety. Before Clarice could respond, Sheriff Dawson ambled over. Afternoon, ladies. Vaughn. He nodded to each of them. "Mrs. Cooper, those tomatoes you promised my wife ready?" "Yes, Sheriff. Mr. Vaughn was just loading them." "Good, good." He turned to Mrs. Pemberton. "You know, Martha, I was just saying to the Reverend how impressed we all are with Mrs. Cooper's progress on that homestead. Most men wouldn't have stuck it out half as long, let alone made it productive." He glanced at Yates. "Of course, having good help makes a difference. Vaughn here's got a reputation for honest work." The pointed endorsement wasn't lost on anyone listening. Mrs. Pemberton sniffed, but retreated, and Clarice shot the sheriff a grateful look. "Don't mind her," Dawson said quietly. "Folks with empty lives fill em with gossip." He tipped his hat and moved on, leaving Clarice and Yates to finish their business. On the wagon ride home, Clarice was unusually quiet, turning Mrs. Pemberton's words over in her mind. She hadn't considered how their arrangement might appear to others, or perhaps she hadn't wanted to consider it. "It doesn't matter what they think," Yates said eventually, reading her silence correctly. "Doesn't it?" Clarice sighed. "I came here to build something honorable, something I could be proud of." "And you are," he insisted. "Anyone with eyes can see that." They crested the hill that overlooked her property, their property, as she'd begun to think of it, and Clarice felt a surge of pride at what they'd accomplished. The cabin with its new roof, the neat rows of crops, the chicken coop now housing 6 hens, the repaired fence line, all of it represented hours of shared labor and determination. "I couldn't have done this alone," she admitted. "When I saw you in town that first day, I was at the end of my rope." Yates was quiet for a long moment. Maybe we both were. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way their conversations usually weren't. Clarice looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the strong, capable man who had appeared when she needed him most, but someone seeking his own kind of redemption. "What are you running from, Yates?" she asked softly. His hands tightened on the reins. "What makes you think I'm running?" "Because I recognize it," she said simply. "I see it in the mirror." He didn't answer immediately, and Clarice didn't press. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the creak of the wagon wheels. "I killed a man. In Denver, 2 years ago." Clarice's breath caught, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "He was robbing the store where I was buying supplies. Shot the owner, a good man with 4 children. I had my gun. I didn't think, just reacted." Yates stared straight ahead. "It was ruled self-defense. The town even called me a hero. But his family, they didn't see it that way. His brother swore he'd see me dead. So you left." "Stayed as long as I could, but the threats got worse. They went after people I worked with. It wasn't right to put others in danger." He finally looked at her. "I'm not proud of running, but I'm not ashamed of what I did either. That man made his choice when he pulled his gun." Clarice reached across the wagon seat and placed her hand over his. "Thank you for telling me. You deserve to know who you've led onto your land," he said quietly. "If you want me to go, I don't," she interrupted, surprised by her own certainty. "We all have pasts, Yates. It's what we do now that matters." That night, Clarice lay awake in her bed, turning their conversation over in her mind. Yates's confession explained much about him: his watchfulness, his reluctance to go to town, the sadness that sometimes shadowed his eyes. But it also highlighted something she'd been trying to ignore: her growing feelings for him. She'd married Thomas when she was 19, more out of practicality than passion. He'd been kind and steady, and she'd grown to love him in her way. But what she felt for Yates was different, a pull that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. August arrived with relentless heat and the promise of their first harvest. The corn stood tall, the vegetable garden flourished, and Clarice began to believe they might actually succeed. Yates had constructed a small barn and was talking about getting a milk cow before winter. Neither of them mentioned his original promise to stay only until harvest, though the unspoken question lingered between them. Their routine had settled into comfortable familiarity, but that changed abruptly one scorching afternoon. Clarice was hanging laundry while Yates repaired a fence line when she spotted dust rising on the horizon, riders approaching fast. "Yates," she called, and he was beside her in moments, rifle in hand. "Get inside," he said tersely. "Lock the door." "I'm not hiding in my own home," she replied, retrieving her shotgun from beside the door. "If it's trouble, we face it together." He gave her a quick, searching look, then nodded. "Stay behind me." As the riders drew closer, Clarice recognized Wade Harlow, and 4 of his men. They pulled up 20 yards from the cabin, spreading out in a loose semicircle. "Afternoon, Mrs. Cooper," Wade called, his tone falsely pleasant. "Vaughn, Harlow," Yates acknowledged. "What brings you out our way?" Wade dismounted, his spurs jingling in the dust. "Interesting choice of words. Our way. Seems you've gotten mighty comfortable on this land." "State your business," Clarice said firmly, standing shoulder to shoulder with Yates despite his attempt to keep her behind him. "Had some cattle go missing," Wade said. "Trail led this direction." Yates's expression hardened. "You're not suggesting we took them?" "I'm suggesting someone did," Wade replied. "And since you're the newest faces around here, we haven't seen any cattle except your own that sometimes stray onto our property," Clarice said, "which we've always returned promptly." Wade stepped closer, his hand resting casually near his gun. "Mind if we look around? Just to be sure." "I do mind," Clarice replied. "This is private property, legally homesteaded." "For now," Wade said, the threat clear in his voice. "But homesteads fail all the time out here. Accidents happen. Fires start." Yates moved then, just a slight shift of his weight, but it was enough to focus Wade's attention on him. "That sounds an awful lot like a threat, Harlow." The tension crackled between them, a spark away from violence, when the sound of approaching horses broke the standoff. Sheriff Dawson rode up with 2 deputies, his expression grim. "Problem here?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew the answer. "Just having a neighborly chat," Wade said smoothly. "About some missing cattle." Dawson dismounted. "Funny thing about those cattle, Harlow. We found them in that box canyon on the south edge of your property, the one your foreman uses for rustled stock." The color drained from Wade's face. "That's a lie. Got 3 witnesses say different," Dawson replied evenly, "including your former foreman, who's singing like a canary to avoid prison time." For a moment, Wade looked like he might reach for his gun, but a subtle movement from the deputies made him reconsider. "This isn't over," he spat before mounting his horse and signaling his men to follow. Dawson watched them go before turning to Clarice and Yates. "You two all right?" "Thanks to your timing," Yates said, lowering his rifle. "How'd you know to come?" "Tom Jackson heard Harlow planning to run you off. Came to warn me." Dawson shook his head. "Harlow's been pulling these stunts for years, using intimidation to expand his range. But this time he's facing serious charges. Those cattle he lost were actually stolen from the Wilcox spread." After the sheriff left, promising to keep an eye on the Harlow outfit, Clarice and Yates stood in silence, the weight of what might have happened settling between them. "He'll be back," Yates said finally. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but men like that don't let go easily." Clarice looked around at the homestead they'd built together. "I won't be driven off my land." "Our land," Yates corrected softly, and the simple words sent warmth spreading through her chest. That night, a new tension hummed between them as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. The confrontation had stripped away pretenses, forcing them to acknowledge what they'd become to each other. "I should move back to town," Yates said suddenly. "At least for a while. It would be safer for you." Clarice turned to him, moonlight silvering her features. "Is that what you want?" "No," he admitted. "But your reputation be damned," she interrupted fiercely. "I don't care what people say. I care about this land, and I care about—" She stopped abruptly, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air between them. Yates moved closer, his eyes searching hers. "About what, Clarice?" She took a deep breath. "About you. I care about you, Yates. More than I should, perhaps." His hand found hers, rough calluses against her work-hardened skin. "I've been fighting this since that first day in town," he confessed. "Telling myself it was wrong to feel this way about a woman who needed my help, that I was taking advantage." Clarice shook her head. "Is that what you think? That I'm some fragile creature who doesn't know her own mind?" She threaded her fingers through his. "I chose to continue this journey alone after Thomas died because I believed I could make my own way. And I chose to let you stay because I saw something in you worth trusting." Yates lifted their joined hands, pressing his lips to her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I've wondered a long time, Clarice. Never thought I'd find a place that felt like home again." "And have you?" she whispered. "Found home." His answer was to lean forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Clarice closed the distance between them, her free hand rising to cup his cheek as their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally separated, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I should still sleep in my lean-to," he murmured. "At least for now." Clarice nodded, understanding his respect for her reputation even if she cared little for it herself. "For now," she agreed. The following weeks were filled with hard work as harvest approached, but now there was a new sweetness to their days. Stolen kisses in the field, hands lingering when they passed tools to each other, quiet conversations that stretched long into the evening. They made no formal declarations, but something profound had shifted between them, as natural and necessary as the changing seasons. September brought their first real harvest: corn, beans, and vegetables enough to see them through winter with surplus to sell in town. The day they loaded the wagon with their bounty, Clarice felt a satisfaction deeper than any she'd known before. "We did it," she said, surveying their work with pride. "We actually did it." Yates pulled her into his arms, unconcerned about who might see. "You did it, Clarice. This was your dream." "Our dream now," she corrected, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. In town, their success was met with genuine admiration from most. Several families placed orders for vegetables, and Mr. Henderson at the general store agreed to buy their excess corn at a fair price. Even Mrs. Pemberton offered grudging congratulations, though her eyes narrowed speculatively at their obvious closeness. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Dawson approached their wagon. "Glad I caught you," he said. "Wanted to let you know Wade Harlow's been sentenced to 5 years for rustling. His brothers took what was left of their herd and headed to Arizona territory." Relief washed over Clarice. The shadow that had hung over their homestead was finally lifted. "That's welcome news, Sheriff," Yates said, shaking the man's hand. "One more thing," Dawson added. "Reverend Collins mentioned he'd be happy to call by your place next Sunday, if you had anything you wanted him to officiate." His eyes twinkled knowingly before he tipped his hat and walked away. On the ride home, they discussed the sheriff's not-so-subtle hint. "He assumes quite a lot," Clarice remarked, though there was no real indignation in her voice. "Does he?" Yates asked quietly. "I love you, Clarice. I think I have since that first day when you were too stubborn to admit you needed help, but too proud to fall." The simple declaration, spoken so plainly, filled Clarice's heart to bursting. "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling both momentous and completely natural. "But marriage, that's a different matter." "Why?" he challenged gently. "We already share everything but a name and a bed. We've built this place together. We face each day side by side." Clarice considered his words. There was wisdom in them, and yet, what about your past? The man hunting you? Yates was silent for a long moment. "I can't promise he won't find me someday, but I'm tired of letting fear of what might happen keep me from living the life I want." He guided the horses around a bend in the road. "I wired a friend in Denver last month. Asked him to let me know if Collins the brother was still looking for me. And word is he left Colorado last year. No one's heard from him since." Yates looked at her earnestly. "I can't guarantee the past won't catch up to me someday, but I'm done running from it. Whatever comes, we'll face it together if you'll have me." They crested the hill that gave them their first view of the homestead, bathed now in the golden light of late afternoon. The cabin with its steady wisp of smoke from the chimney, the barn, the fields now dotted with harvest stubble, all of it represented not just their labor, but their shared vision. "Yes," Clarice said simply. "I'll have you, Yates Vaughn, for all the days we're given." They were married the following Sunday in front of their cabin, with Sheriff Dawson and his wife as witnesses and Reverend Collins officiating. Clarice wore her best dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Yates had a new shirt he'd bought specially for the occasion. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. Two people who had found each other against all odds, pledging to walk together through whatever life brought them. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. That night, as they lay together in what was now their bed, Clarice marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just a few months. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "About that day in town," she replied. "How close I was to giving up, if you hadn't been there." "But I was," he said simply, "and you would have found your strength even without me." That's who you are, Clarice. She propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the soft glow of the banked fire. Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to. She kissed him softly. Take my strength, you said. I didn't understand then what you were really offering. And what was that? He asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. A partnership. A chance to be stronger together than either of us could be alone. She settled back against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. I never expected to find love again. Especially not here, in this harsh place. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the harshest conditions, Yates murmured. Like those wildflowers that push up through the rocks after a long drought. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Inside their small cabin, Clarice and Yates held each other, two souls who had weathered their own personal droughts and found, against all odds, a place to flourish together. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that blanketed their land in pristine white. They had prepared well. The root cellar was stocked, firewood stacked high against the cabin, the animals secured in the snug barn Yates had built. The cold months that might once have seemed isolating now felt like a gift, time for just the two of them to dream and plan for the future. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Yates often reading aloud from one of the books they'd acquired on their infrequent trips to town. Clarice would mend or knit as she listened, occasionally glancing up to find him watching her instead of the page, love plain in his eyes. What will we plant come spring? He asked one night as snow tapped gently against the windows. I was thinking we might try wheat in the north field. Clarice nodded. And perhaps expand the vegetable garden. Mrs. Dawson says there's good money in selling fresh produce to the railroad workers. We should consider getting a few more chickens, too, Yates added. And maybe a milk cow. Our eggs sell out every time we go to town. They continued this way, building their future word by word, dream by dream, never taking for granted the miracle of having found each other. The hardships that had once defined their separate lives now seemed like necessary steps on the path that had brought them together. Spring arrived in a rush of wildflowers and birdsong, and with it came news that the railroad would indeed be expanding through Dustwater Creek by year's end. The announcement brought a flurry of activity to the region. New settlers, businesses preparing for growth, land prices rising. We could sell, Yates suggested as they discussed the news over breakfast. The homestead would fetch a good price now. Clarice looked around at the cabin that had become a true home, at the land they had coaxed into productivity through sheer determination. Is that what you want? He considered her question seriously. I want what makes you happy. This was your dream first. Our dream now, she reminded him. And no, I don't want to sell. This land has our blood and sweat in it. Our future. She hesitated, then added softly. Our children's future, God willing. Yates's eyes widened. Clarice, are you? She nodded, a smile blooming on her face. Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. Come August, there'll be 3 of us here. The joy that transformed Yates's face was something Clarice knew she would remember until her dying day. He crossed to her in 2 strides, lifting her gently and spinning her around, his laughter mingling with hers in the sunlit kitchen. A baby, he whispered, setting her down and pressing his hand reverently to her still flat stomach. Our baby. Our future, she agreed, covering his hand with her own. The months that followed were busy ones. Yates insisted on adding a room to the cabin for the baby, working tirelessly even after long days in the fields. Clarice's body changed as their child grew within her, but she remained active in tending their growing farm, refusing to be treated as fragile despite Yates's protective instincts. Word of their expanding homestead spread, and occasionally new settlers would stop by, seeking advice on starting their own claims. Clarice and Yates always welcomed them, sharing hard-earned knowledge and sometimes a meal. They understood better than most the value of kindness in this challenging land. August arrived with relentless heat and the ripening of their second harvest. Clarice, now heavy with child, was forced to limit her activities, much to her frustration. One particularly hot afternoon, as she sat shelling peas in the shade of the porch, she felt the first contraction. Yates, she called, her voice steady despite the sudden knowledge that their child was coming. He appeared from the barn, took one look at her face, and knew. Within minutes, he had hitched the wagon and helped her into it, tucking blankets around her despite the heat. Mrs. Dawson said she'd attend me. Clarice reminded him as another contraction gripped her. We need to stop in town. The journey to Dustwater Creek was one Clarice would later recall only in fragments: the jolting of the wagon, Yates's concerned face, the waves of pain that came with increasing frequency. By the time they reached town, she was gripping the wagon seat with white knuckles, fighting to remain composed. Mrs. Dawson took charge immediately, directing Yates to carry Clarice to a room she kept prepared for such purposes. You wait outside, she told him firmly. This is women's work now. The hours that followed were the hardest of Clarice's life, a battle that made homesteading seem simple by comparison. Mrs. Dawson was skilled and kind but unflinching in her commands, guiding Clarice through the ancient journey of bringing new life into the world. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Clarice gave a final, tremendous push, and their daughter slipped into Mrs. Dawson's waiting hands. The baby's indignant cry filled the room, strong and vital, and Clarice collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but triumphant. A perfect girl, Mrs. Dawson announced, cleaning and swaddling the infant before placing her in Clarice's arms. With a good set of lungs on her, Clarice gazed down at the tiny face, overwhelmed by a love so vast it seemed impossible her heart could contain it. The baby had a dusting of dark hair, and, when she briefly opened her eyes, Clarice glimpsed a blue that matched Yates's exactly. Let the man in before he wears a hole in my floor, Mrs. Dawson said with a smile, moving to open the door. Yates entered hesitantly, his face drawn with hours of worry. When he saw Clarice holding their child, he stopped as if frozen, wonder and relief washing over his features. Come meet your daughter, Clarice said softly. He approached the bed carefully, perching on its edge as if afraid his weight might disturb them. When Clarice placed the swaddled infant in his arms, his hands so capable with tools and weapons trembled slightly. She's so small, he whispered, awe in his voice. But strong, Clarice assured him. Like her father. Yates looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. What shall we call her? Clarice had been considering names for months, but in this moment, only one seemed right. Hope, she said. Because that's what she is. What you gave me that day in town when I could barely stand. What we've built together. Hope, Yates repeated, testing the name as he gazed down at their daughter. It's perfect. Like her. They stayed in town for 3 days, accepting Mrs. Dawson's hospitality while Clarice regained enough strength for the journey home. When they finally returned to their homestead, it was with a new awareness of what they had created: not just a farm or a marriage, but a family, a legacy that would continue beyond them. The first weeks with Hope were a joyful adjustment. The rhythm of their days now revolved around her needs, with Yates taking on more of the outdoor work while Clarice recovered and cared for their daughter. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, Hope cradled between them, marveling at each tiny movement and expression. She has your determination, Yates observed one evening as Hope stubbornly refused to sleep despite Clarice's gentle rocking. Look at that scowl. Pure Cooper stubbornness. Clarice laughed. And your eyes. Already so watchful, taking everything in. As autumn painted the landscape in russet and gold, their homestead continued to flourish. The harvest was bountiful, providing not only for their needs, but also yielding enough surplus to build their savings. The railroad's advance brought new opportunities, with Yates occasionally taking well-paid work helping to survey the approaching line. Word arrived that Dustwater Creek would soon have its own permanent doctor, a development that brought Clarice particular relief now that they had hoped to consider. The town was growing, transforming from a struggling settlement into a community with a future. Winter returned, wrapping their world in snow and silence. Now, however, the isolated months held new joy as they watched Hope discover her hands, learn to smile, and eventually roll over, each milestone celebrated as the miracle it was. On Christmas Eve, with Hope finally asleep in the cradle Yates had crafted, they exchanged simple gifts by firelight. Clarice had knitted Yates a new scarf, while he presented her with a small wooden box he'd made, its lid carved with wildflowers like those she'd worn in her hair at their wedding. Open it, he urged, and inside she found a delicate silver locket. It's beautiful, she whispered, opening it to find tiny portraits of Yates and Hope inside. So you always have us near your heart, he explained, even when I'm working the far fields. Clarice kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the love she sometimes found difficult to express in words. When they separated, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Did you ever imagine this? She asked. That day in town, when you saw me about to collapse in line? Yates's arms tightened around her. Not specifically this, but I knew you were someone worth knowing, worth helping. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Worth loving, though I didn't let myself think that yet. Take my strength, Clarice murmured, echoing his words from that fateful day. You offered it so simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was, he replied, the most natural thing I've ever done. In the cradle, Hope stirred and made a small sound. They both turned to look at her, this perfect embodiment of their love and hopes. We should get some sleep, Clarice said reluctantly. She'll be awake with the dawn, Christmas or no. But neither moved immediately, savoring this quiet moment amid the life they had built together. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their land in pristine white. Inside, the fire crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the home that had once seemed an impossible dream to a woman alone. As they finally rose to prepare for bed, Clarice paused to look around the cabin at the cradle where their daughter slept, at the table where they shared meals and dreams, at the man who had appeared in her life precisely when she needed him most. From the brink of collapse to this abundance, it seemed like a miracle, yet she knew it had been built by their own hands, day by day, choice by choice. Thank you, she said softly to Yates as he banked the fire for the night. He looked up, a question in his eyes. For what? For everything, Clarice replied simply. For being the kind of man who offers his strength to a stranger. For staying. For loving me. Yates crossed to her, taking her hands in his. Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done, he said, and the best decision I've ever made. As they climbed into bed, Clarice nestled against him, warm and secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. From that first moment outside the general store to this quiet Christmas Eve, they had forged something precious and enduring, a love born of kindness and strengthened by shared purpose. Outside, the New Mexico night wrapped around their small cabin, stars glittering in the vast sky above. Inside, Clarice and Yates slept peacefully, their daughter between them, 3 hearts beating in the rhythm of family, of home, of love found in the most unexpected of circumstances. Spring returned, bringing with it Hope's first birthday and news that the railroad would reach Dustwater Creek by summer's end. The town buzzed with activity, new buildings rising, families arriving weekly, the promise of prosperity tangible in the air. The Cooper Vaughn homestead, as it was now known throughout the area, had expanded as well. Yates had added not only the nursery, but also a proper kitchen and a small porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the cabin. Their livestock now included 6 milk cows, 2 dozen chickens, and 4 sturdy horses. The fields stretched in neat rows, a testament to careful planning and relentless work. On a warm May afternoon, as Clarice watched Hope toddle determinedly after a butterfly in the garden, a wagon approached their property. She shaded her eyes, recognizing Sheriff Dawson and another man she didn't know. Yates, she called toward the barn, where he was repairing a harness. Company coming. He emerged, wiping his hands on a rag, and moved to stand beside her, instinctively placing himself slightly in front as the wagon drew closer. Afternoon, Vaughn, Mrs. Vaughn, the sheriff called as he pulled the horses to a stop. Got someone here who's been asking after you in town. The stranger climbed down from the wagon, a well-dressed man in his 40s with a serious expression. Mr. Vaughn, he said, approaching with his hand extended. My name is Daniel Collins. Clarice felt Yates stiffen beside her, his body suddenly alert in a way she hadn't seen since the confrontation with Wade Harlow. Collins, the name of the brother who had sworn vengeance. Mr. Collins, Yates acknowledged cautiously, shaking the man's hand but maintaining his protective stance. What brings you to our home? Collins glanced at Clarice and Hope, who had abandoned her butterfly chase to hide behind her mother's skirts. Perhaps we could speak privately? Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of my wife, Yates replied firmly. The man nodded, seemingly unsurprised. Very well. I've spent 2 years tracking you down, Mr. Vaughn. Not to harm you, as you might fear, but to thank you. Confusion crossed Yates's face. Thank me? For killing your brother. For stopping him before he destroyed more lives, including his own. Collins sighed heavily. My brother was not the man I thought he was. After his death, I discovered he'd been involved in multiple robberies. The storekeeper he shot wasn't his first victim. Sheriff Dawson stepped forward. Mr. Collins has been working with law enforcement across 3 territories to piece together his brother's activities. Turns out he was wanted for 2 murders in addition to the attempted one in Denver. I wanted to believe my brother was innocent, Collins continued. That you had shot him without cause. It was easier than accepting the truth. He shook his head, but the evidence became overwhelming. And then I found his journal. Journal? Yates asked, where he detailed his crimes. Bragged about them, even. Disgust colored Collins's voice. I came to apologize for the threats made against you. They were based on a brother I thought I knew, not the man he actually was. The tension slowly drained from Yates's body as he processed this unexpected turn of events. I never wanted to kill him, he said quietly. I just reacted when I saw that storekeeper go down. I know that now, Collins replied. And I'm sorry my misguided loyalty drove you from your home. He glanced around at their homestead. Though it appears you found a new one. Clarice stepped forward then, hope still clinging to her skirts. Would you join us for dinner, Mr. Collins? You too, Sheriff. It's the least we can offer after you've come all this way. Collins looked surprised by the invitation, but accepted with genuine gratitude. As they all moved toward the cabin, Yates caught Clarice's hand, squeezing it in silent thanks for her generosity of spirit. The meal was initially awkward but gradually eased into companionable conversation. Collins proved to be an educated man with a dry wit, and by the time dessert was served, even Hope had warmed to him, allowing him to bounce her on his knee while she giggled delightedly. As the sheriff and Collins prepared to leave, the latter turned to Yates one last time. I've submitted formal statements to authorities in all relevant jurisdictions clearing your name in relation to my brother's death. You no longer need to look over your shoulder, Mr. Vaughn. Thank you, Yates said simply, extending his hand. That means more than you know. After their guests departed, Clarice and Yates stood together on the porch, watching the wagon disappear into the gathering dusk. Hope had finally exhausted herself and was sleeping soundly in her crib. How do you feel? Clarice asked, studying her husband's profile. Yates considered the question. Lighter, he finally said. As if a weight I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there has suddenly lifted. She slipped her arm around his waist, leaning into him. No more ghosts hunting you. No more running, he agreed, pulling her closer. Though I'd already decided that the day I married you, whatever came, we would face it here, together. Clarice smiled up at him. And now we build the future we've been planning. Without shadows. He kissed her softly. Starting with that second bedroom we've been discussing. Hope might like a brother or sister someday. Clarice's smile widened. Sooner than you might think. Yates pulled back slightly, searching her face. Clarice, are you saying? She nodded, joy bubbling up within her. Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. Come winter, our family will grow again. The look of pure happiness that transformed Yates's face was one Clarice would treasure forever. He lifted her gently, mindful of her condition even in his excitement, and spun her in a circle on the porch, both of them laughing like children. Another baby, he whispered when he set her down, his hand coming to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. Another miracle. Our family, Clarice agreed, covering his hand with her own. Our strength. As darkness settled over their land, they remained on the porch, talking quietly about their plans and dreams. The railroad would bring new opportunities and challenges. Hope would continue to grow, soon to be joined by a sibling. Their farm would expand with each passing season. But beneath all these practical considerations ran a deeper current of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought them together that scorching day outside the general store, for the courage that had allowed them to trust each other, for the love that had transformed 2 wounded souls into a family. Take my strength, Yates had offered that day, a simple phrase that had changed everything. And Clarice had taken it, not realizing that in doing so, she was offering her own strength in return, creating something far greater than either could have achieved alone. As stars appeared in the vast New Mexico sky, Clarice and Yates Vaughn held each other close, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would meet it together, two people who had found in each other not just love, but home.